Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. This time we're taking a look at a man whose name is practically synonymous with mystery and controversy, Grigori Rasputin. Was he a mystic? Was he a con man? Or, well, maybe somewhere in between.
That really is the question, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, Rasputin's life was a whirlwind of contradictions. This is a Siberian peasant who rose to become a confidant of the Russian Tsarina. He claimed to have healing powers and even said he could see the future.
I know you've got some fascinating sources for us today. They really paint a vivid picture of Russia on the verge of revolution. A desperate royal family clinging to hope, and this enigmatic Rasputin stepping right into the spotlight.
Yeah, and it's within those sources, those different perspectives and interpretations, that we might just find some answers. So let's start from the beginning. Rasputin was born to a peasant family in Siberia back in 1869. The details of his early life are a little sketchy. We know he had a strong interest in religion and even went on these pilgrimages looking for spiritual enlightenment.
One source even mentioned he might have spent some time in a monastery, maybe even as penance for theft. It sounds like our mysterious mystic might have had a bit of a rebellious streak in his younger days.
Yeah, he did. And it was during this period of religious exploration that Rasputin seems to have gone through a transformation. When he came back from his travels, he started advocating for a more personal, emotional connection with God. He even joined a sect called the Klisti.
Hold on. The Klisti. Who are they?
Well, they were a religious group known for these really ecstatic rituals. Think lots of singing, dancing, and even trances. Some historians think that these practices might have influenced Rasputin's later behavior and the rumors that eventually started to spring up around him.
Okay, so the seeds of controversy are already being sown. But even with these whispers, Rasputin still managed to gain quite a following, especially among the peasants, right?
Absolutely. His charisma and his claims of being able to heal the sick drew a lot of people to him. He became known as a starus, a spiritual advisor basically, offering counsel and comfort to those who needed him.
And wasn't it this reputation that eventually led him to the Romanovs,
Hmm.
Russia's ruling dynasty?
Right. Tsar Nicholas II and his wife, Alexandra, they were in a very difficult position. Their son, Alexei, he suffered from hemophilia, a really serious condition that could lead to uncontrollable bleeding. They had tried all sorts of medical treatments, but nothing seemed to work.
Yeah, and then comes Rasputin, the peasant mystic who can apparently heal the sick. It must have been quite a scene.
It was a turning point for sure. Rasputin came to the palace and he somehow eased Alexei's bleeding. Now, whether you want to call it divine intervention or maybe the placebo effect, who knows? But for Alexandra, she was convinced that he saved her son.
And that's when his influence really started to take off, right? He became one of Alexandra's most trusted advisors, which a lot of people saw as a very dangerous mix of religion and politics.
Exactly. Alexandra was incredibly devoted to her son and deeply religious, so she started leaning on Rasputin more and more for advice, not just about matters of faith, but political decisions too.
But I was reading that 20th century medicine wasn't exactly advanced. One of the sources suggested that Alexei might have actually gotten better because they stopped giving him aspirin. Aspirin was a pretty common blood thinner at the time.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. It's quite possible that Alexei's condition would seem to improve if he stopped taking aspirin, regardless of whether Rasputin did anything or not. But for Alexandra, I mean, she was desperate for a miracle, so Rasputin's apparent success was all the proof she needed.
So it sounds like there's already a pattern emerging here. We're seeing charisma, circumstance, and a willingness to believe. But while he was becoming close with the royal family, outside the palace, his reputation wasn't looking so good.
That's right. Rumors about his behavior started circulating, his supposed involvement with the Klisti sect and whispers of debauchery, things like that.
And wasn't there talk about sexual misconduct?
Yeah. All those rumors, they were fueled by his enemies at court. Plus, the social unrest that was already brewing in Russia at the time. They started to paint this picture of him as this dangerous, corrupting force on the Tsarina.
And remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of World War I, which was putting immense strain on Russia and fueling resentment towards the monarchy.
Exactly. Russia was losing. The economy was a mess. People were struggling. Rasputin, with his close ties to the Tsarina and his growing political influence, became a symbol of everything that people felt was wrong with the regime.
Wow. So we've got Rasputin, the peasant mystic, who rises to power and influence, but at the same time becomes a target of suspicion and scorn. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah, it is. It's a story about ambition, intrigue, and the dangers of power. But before we get too deep into those controversies and his eventual downfall, let's take a closer look at his relationship with Tsarina Alexandra. What was it about him that captivated her so completely?
You're right. Her letters really give us some incredible insights. They're filled with this devotion and praise for our friend, as she called him.
Right. Our friend, the prophet, God's messenger even, her belief in him was incredible.
We should definitely dig into those letters. They sound fascinating.
Her belief in him really was extraordinary. She saw him as a spiritual guide, someone who could protect her family, and even a source of political wisdom.
But going through all these sources you gave me, it's clear that not everybody felt that way about him. The nobility, the politicians, even some people in the church saw Rasputin as a dangerous outsider, someone who threatened the stability of Russia.
They did, and those different viewpoints, they played a big part in shaping how people saw Rasputin. They're the ones who spread those rumors about his debauchery and how he was manipulating the Tsarina. All that talk about him being power-hungry.
One of the most scandalous accusations was about his connection to that Callisti sect. Some sources even say he kept practicing their rituals right there in the royal court.
The Klikisti, yeah. Well, as we talked about earlier, they were known for these practices that some people might find kind of shocking, especially if they weren't part of the group. You know, the line between being really devoted to your religion and doing something that others see as scandalous can be pretty thin.
So are we saying that those accusations were completely made up? Just ways to make him look bad?
It's hard to say for sure. Trying to separate fact from fiction in Rasputin's story is tough. There's no question that he was unconventional, even shocking to some people. But were his actions driven by genuine religious belief? Or was he intentionally playing up this image of a wild, untamed mystic to boost his own influence?
It's like we're trying to read his mind from over a century ago. But one thing's for sure, those rumors, whether they were true or just exaggerated, they really affected how the public saw him.
Yeah, they did. Rasputin became a symbol of all the growing discontent in Russia. People blamed him for all sorts of problems, from bad political decisions to losses in the war. It made things even worse for the Romanov dynasty. They were already struggling to hold on to power.
And then there's the whole assassination plot. Talk about a story that would have been all over the news back then. A group of nobles decided they had to do something about Rasputin. They thought that getting rid of him would save Russia. Prince Felix Yusupov was one of them.
Yeah, Yusupov. In his memoir, he makes the night of the assassination sound pretty intense. He describes Rasputin as this almost mythical figure, someone who could resist poison and shrug off bullets.
But the autopsy report tells a different story, right?
Mm-hmm.
It suggests that Rasputin's death was much more straightforward. Still brutal, of course, but not quite as dramatic as Yusupov made it seem.
Right, the autopsy contradicts a lot of what Yusupov described. It's possible that he exaggerated things, maybe to make himself look like a hero or just to protect himself.
So even Rasputin's death is wrapped up in myths and propaganda. It adds another layer of mystery to an already complicated story.
Exactly. Even in death, Rasputin couldn't escape all the controversy that surrounded him.
So where does all this leave us in our attempt to understand Grigori Rasputin? Was he a true mystic with a gift for healing? A con man who took advantage of a family in need? Or maybe a tragic figure caught in the middle of an empire falling apart?
Those are the questions that keep historians busy and keep people fascinated by Rasputin's story. While we might never have all the answers, I think the process of looking at the evidence, all the different perspectives, and what was going on in the world at the time can help us get a clearer picture of this enigmatic figure.
It's like peeling back layers of an onion, isn't it? Every layer you peel back reveals something new, but there's always another layer underneath. And maybe the real truth isn't about finding one definitive answer. Maybe it's about appreciating all the complexity.
I like that. And speaking of complexity, one thing we haven't talked about yet is Rasputin's supposed ability to see the future.
Yeah.
There are all these stories about his prophecies. Some of them seem to be accurate, others are a bit harder to figure out.
That's right. Time to explore the world of Rasputin the prophet. Did he really have the power to see what was going to happen? Or was he just really good at playing mind games, using people's hopes and fears to his advantage? Especially in a country that felt like it was on the brink of collapse.
That's what we need to figure out. Was he a true visionary or a master manipulator? We'll dig into those questions after a quick break.
Did he really see the future, or was he just really good at those mind games?
Well, prophecy is a really strange part of his story. Some people think it's just a bunch of stories. Others see it as proof that he had some kind of deeper spiritual connection.
Yeah. You gave me some sources that talk about his predictions. Some were pretty specific. Others were more like vague warnings. He supposedly predicted that the Romanovs would fall, and even his own death. But how can we tell if he actually saw these things coming or if it was just coincidence or maybe clever interpretation after the fact?
It's hard to know for sure. Take the prediction of his own death, for example. Some stories say that he knew exactly when and how he would die. But prophecies often make more sense looking back. It's easy to twist the details to fit what already happened.
Yeah, it's like reading a horoscope.
Ah.
You can always find a way to connect the predictions to your life, even if they're super vague. But for the people who already believed in Rasputin's powers, these pronouncements would have been really powerful.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's where it gets tricky, trying to figure out what was genuine belief and what was manipulation. Did Rasputin actually think he could see the future? Or was he using prophecy as a way to get more power and control?
We might never know the answer to that. But if you think about the context, Russia in the early 1900s was a place where people were really drawn to prophecies and apocalyptic ideas. The country was at war, there was famine, and social unrest was everywhere. People were desperate for something to believe in, a glimmer of hope in a world that felt like it was falling apart.
And that's where Rasputin came in. With his charisma and his claims of spiritual insight, he filled that void. Maybe he did it on purpose, maybe he didn't. But he definitely tapped into all those anxieties and hopes that people were feeling.
It reminds us that we can't just look at historical figures in isolation. They're products of their time,
Yeah.
and their actions. They can have a huge impact on the way things unfold.
That brings us back to the question we've been asking all along. Was Grigori Rasputin a visionary or was he a con artist?
A holy man or a fake? It's easy to want to put them in one box or the other, but maybe the real answer is somewhere in between. Maybe it's a mix of genuine belief and opportunism and all the complexities of human nature.
I think that's a really important point. It's tempting to oversimplify things to look for easy answers in a world that's often confusing and messy. But history is a lot like life, rarely black and white.
So at the end of our deep dive into the enigma that is Grigori Rasputin, what have we learned? We've got all these stories. Some we can verify, others are lost in myth and speculation. And a man who continues to fascinate and spark debate over 100 years after his death.
And maybe, just maybe, a reminder that the line between a true visionary and a skilled con artist can be incredibly thin, especially when charisma, opportunity, and the power of belief all come together.
It's a good reminder for us to be critical thinkers, to question what we think we know, and to look at things from different angles before making up our minds.
After all, history isn't just about the past. It's a conversation that keeps going, offering us insights and lessons that are still relevant today.
Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into the mystery of Rasputin. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and remember that the most interesting stories are often the ones that don't have simple answers.